Hello and welcome to this video on the Bamford or the Oxford classification of stroke. So the aims of the video are to learn about the four Bamford classifications of stroke and sort of the differences between them, as well as to learn that basic structure of the circle of Willis, just to sort of help apply it to the actual classification, because I believe that a bit of knowledge of the actual anatomy will help sort of applying it to the theory of the classifications. So just a brief overview, what is the Bamford classification? So it is a system of classifying ischemic strokes, or strokes where there's been an actual blockage of the blood flow to the brain, and it uses the clinical presentation to differentiate between different classifications as opposed to using imaging. It was created in 1991 by Bamford et al. Using the Oxfordshire Community Stroke Project, a community-based study of sort of a patient's first ever stroke. So moving on to the clinical presentation, with a total anterior circulation stroke. This requires all three of these signs for diagnosis, and it's commonly linked with ischemia in the deep and superficial middle cerebral artery, with sort of a large vessel occlusion. And the three sort of symptoms are homonymous hemianopia, ipsilateral motor and or sensory deficit, and higher cerebral dysfunction, which includes dysphasia, dyscalculia, or visuospatial disorders. And then for PACS, or partial anterior circulation stroke, it is again the same three, except only two of the three are actually required for a diagnosis. So only two of the homonymous hemianopia, ipsilateral motor and or sensory deficit, and high cerebral dysfunction. So in this case, the ischemia is commonly either in one of the upper or lower middle cerebral arteries, as opposed to being a larger sort of occlusion. And then for the posterior circulation stroke, it requires one of these five symptoms for a diagnosis. These include cranial nerve palsy and a contralateral motor or sensory deficit, bilateral motor or sensory deficit, disorder of conjugate eye movement, which is the ability to move eyes sort of in unison, cerebellar dysfunction due to that sort of posterior circulation being affected, which commonly does which supplies the cerebellum and sort of the midbrain and the brainstem. And there's also the isolated homonymous hemianopia, where it's just the hemianopia in isolation, as it suggests. And then finally, we have a lax. So to diagnose a lax, it requires one of these four sort of symptoms, which include either a pure sensory stroke, so purely sensory loss or sensation being affected, a pure motor stroke, so pure sort of one-sided weakness, a sensory motor stroke, so both motor and sensory loss, or ataxic hemiparesis, where there is weakness and poor coordination on the same side of the body. And as I'd mentioned before, sort of it's affected, or as I'd hinted before, it's affected by these smaller lenticular striate arteries, which, as I've shown in the diagram prior, these smaller lenticulostriate arteries which come off the middle cerebral artery and then perfuse the actual sort of basal ganglia and the actual sort of internal capsule, which then relays messages on to the sort of cortex. So yeah, I think that's sort of touched everything. So those are sort of the basics of the Bamford classification. I hope that this was sort of informative. I'm mainly using this as sort of a revision tool myself. So if you do have any questions at all, just please let me know. And if there's any alterations that are required, please let me know once again. So yeah, thank you. I've got the references that I've used here, and thank you for watching. Hopefully this was informative once again.